So we mentioned it earlier, but obviously Baylor had a lot of problems in that opening loss to Texas State. You could just pick one. I mean, offensive line got manhandled by a Sun Belt team that had a completely revamped roster. I'll be writing about this in tomorrow's paper, but Baylor's secondary just left some receivers wide open. That was sort of alarming. And then there was a game plan that yielded only 7 carries for the reigning Big 12 Freshman of the Year in Richard Reese. Zach, where do you feel like the biggest fix needs to come from week 1 to week 2? And is there one area, you may have already alluded to this earlier, but is there one area that could be particularly vulnerable to the Utes?
Yeah, I know I already touched on the offensive line. I feel like every press conference and availability, I'm asking about the offensive line, and I know it's not the most sexy position group, but I'll going off of that a little bit with Richard Reese and Dominic Richardson, the running backs, not kind of doing what I think Baylor wants them to do, right? Want them to do. Richard Reese getting 7 carries, to me, that's not. You're not going to win any game against Texas State or Utah or, Long Island if Richard Reese is getting 7 carries. And I think that Aranda knows that, and Richard Reese knows that, and Dominic Richard, I talked to him yesterday. He certainly knows that. So, but Utah is just that scares me. If I'm Baylor, that defensive front, you alluded that it's not even their best defensive front. That's just scary if I'm Baylor. You need to get him going. You need to get Dominic Richardson and Richard Reese going. And if you can't do that, it's going to be a struggle, right? So
yeah, I mean,
think
he's one of your best players. I mean, get him the ball. I didn't really understand a lot of the play calling in game 1. But I think you and I talked about this at one point recently. You know, Richard Reese last year, there was back-to-back games where he had 31 and 36 carries. That's a lot in modern college football. But Baylor won those games. One of them was on the road at Texas Tech on Patrick Mahomes night in Lubbock, and then inexplicably, right after that, they just stopped running him as much. I looked up this stat yesterday. I should have written it down, but I think I've got it right. When Richard Reese gets 15 or more carries in his career, like Baylor's 4-2, and then I think they're like 2-7 or something when he does. So, I mean, it's not probably a perfect stat because a lot of times, if you're falling behind in game, you are going to pass the ball more and get away from the running game, perhaps. But nevertheless, that's a guy I think they need to feed often. So,
against Florida's running back Trevor Etienne, who I think is pretty good, right? That he only had 7 carries in that loss to Utah. So I don't know if that's a Utah thing or. So it again,
well, didn't they?
It's scary.
Didn't Utah hold Eric the Gators 14 yards rushing or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. 0.6 yards per carry, which partly impacted by the number of sacks they got, but still, Florida never really was able to get going on the ground against the Utes. Where Utah's defense was susceptible was against some of those long passes. They did surrender some yards through the air. Gators quarterback Graham Mertz, I want to say, threw for 330-ish yards. Part of that is the fact that Utah got out to a big lead and Florida, just stopped running the ball quite as much and were put in a position where they had to pass it. But Utah's working in a largely new secondary this year. Cole Bishop, one of their safeties, is really the only, kind of guy returning who got a ton of time from a year ago. So, you mentioned Baylor's defensive backs leaving receivers uncovered a few times. That happened once or twice with Utah against Florida as well. So there are some yards to be gained. I suspect that, I'll be interested to see if it was kind of a one-off versus Florida, just because of the fact that they abandoned the run game as early as they did. But then again, like, they weren't getting a ton from it when they were trying to early on either. So I'm curious to see kind of how effective the Bears are against that Utes front, especially given that they expect to have some of those starters back this game. They were missing both of their starting defensive tackles, one of whom, Junior Tafuna, they think is like legit, right? Like not only all Pac-12 level, but maybe like possibly all American approaching levels. So they can get him back. That might be tough sledding for the Bears, but then again, if they're if their backup quarterback can get going, I think there are potentially some yards to be gained that can keep them in it. And again, I think like I was filming a TV spot on Saturday while that game was happening. I kept like refreshing my phone, like looking at, and I'm like, what is going on there? But at the same time, you guys were moving the ball, right? Like I want to say you wound up with more than 500 yards in the game. It just became a matter of red zone efficiency, I think, which Utah surrendered yards as well. But then once the ball got inside the red zone, their defense like really kind of took it to another level. So it's going to be curious to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I would say Baylor's offense did some good things, even in spite of the offensive line. I think perhaps the more alarming stuff might have happened on defense, just with how Texas State kind of carved up Baylor. But should be fun at any rate on Saturday. Be real interesting to see how this one plays out. And who knows? I mean, one factor that could be an advantage for Baylor is that 11 a.m. kickoff. It's going to be hot, like crazy hot. I mean, that's just what we've had here. And I'm sure, I know the country is dealing with a heat wave, but man, it's hot in Texas. And so I don't know if that'll be an advantage for the Bears, but we'll see.